In this video, we're going to start targeting mobile devices. And in particular, in this one, we will make our website respond to landscape tablets. And so let's continue decreasing our viewport width here so that we can find our next breakpoint. So let's keep going down. Right. And maybe let's stop here for now. So let's see if some things are broken here. And for now, it still looks quite nice. But here, if we take a look, then the text here is now looking quite bad, actually. So it's a really thin column with a lot of lines. Also here, we start getting text in multiple lines, and the same here. So in some of these columns, we have now 4 lines in here as well. And also here, this one here. So this entire section is now a bit too high because also this text here moved into 3 lines. And the same thing actually here. Now, since we're so zoomed out, it actually still looks quite okay. But if we make it like 100%, and like imagining that this is a tablet, then maybe we can start to see that everything looks like really huge here, right? So the design that we built has a lot of spacing, and it also has some really big text in some situations. And so we now should start making this a bit smaller. Actually, let's move up a little bit more here, because well, this one here is one of the breakpoints that I use, I would say always, so 1200 pixels, because that is where we start getting into mobile device territory. Now, as we just learned previously, we shouldn't just base our breakpoints on the device width, but also on where the design breaks. And in this case, it's not yet really visible that the design is breaking, at least not in terms of the layout. But still, everything is quite too big here. So everything looks like huge. So even at 1200, and so yeah, let's fix that right now. So we will add a breakpoint at 1200 pixels, which is something that I usually always do. So add media, max width. And now remember how we make the calculation from pixel to M. So that's 1200 divided by 16. So that's a nice round number of 75 M. Let me grab this. And so this is below 1200 pixels. Let's say tablets here. Or actually landscape tablets. So tablets in the orientation of landscape, because with just tablets, we usually mean them in portrait mode. Okay. And so let's start fixing that overall feeling that we have that everything is too big. So how do you think we could do that? Well, we can now finally use to our advantage the fact that we used responsive units from the very start. Now, in fact, everything that we're doing here only works because we already have the other 3 responsive web design ingredients already in place. So we already have a fluid grid and responsive images and responsive units, right? Otherwise, none of this would work at all. So all the fluidity that we can see here, like that the design even changes a little bit when we do this, when we change the viewport width, all of that is only because we already have flexible images and a fluid diet in the first place, right? And so now let's make use of that other ingredient that is responsive units. Now, what do I mean with responsive units? Well, I simply mean the fact that we have been using rem all the time here, right? And what that means is that all of these length, so all of the sizes basically that we defined anywhere on the page, are dependent on this one setting right here. So on this font size, right? So if we now change this, every single length and every single font size on the page will immediately change, right? So if we want to make everything smaller, basically, we can simply change that font size. And so that is the big trick of using this technique. So of sizing everything using rem. So font size, and now for demonstration, let me just actually set it just to pixels here and to something really small. So 5 pixels is of course way too small, but I just want you to demonstrate the dramatic effect that we can achieve with this simple change here. So let's make this big again, and let's zoom out here. And so watch what happens once we approach. Yeah, you saw that everything became really small, right? And again, all of that is simply because of the power of sizing everything in rem and then changing that one setting. So basically changing the definition of what one rem is right there in the media query. So just with this, everything became small again, right? Except here for these images, because they are indeed sized in percentages, right? Now, of course, we don't want to make this dramatic of a change here. So here, actually, I want to set it to 9 pixel. So just moving it down 1 pixel, basically. But of course, I also don't want to set it in pixel, but in percentages. So 9 pixel divided by 16 pixels. So again, using the calculator here, 9 divided by 16 is 56.25%. Okay, so 56.25%. And so now the change will not be as dramatic, but there will be some change. So let's see. And there it is. So all of a sudden, everything became just a small tad smaller, right? And so this can make a difference indeed. So even, of course, the layout itself, as we come here, is now smaller, right? So it was already touching the sides here, but now not anymore. Because now our container, which used to have 1200 pixels, now only has, let's see, so 120 rem. So it used to be 1200, but now it is only 1080 pixels. So that's actually a big difference, right? So that's very cool. This is really an amazing trick that we can use when we build these kinds of websites. So back in the day when I built my first responsive website and I didn't know about this, well, I would simply have to go and change manually all the single pixel length and all the font sizes that I had defined in pixels. And that would be so much work, and with this, it is really a lot easier. Now, of course, that doesn't cure all the problems. So some text is probably still a bit too big, so we can fix that. For example, this text right here still looks quite big. So the secondary heading, and the same also for the tertiary heading. And probably it's also time to decrease the spacing in our grid. So here the spacing between these columns is starting to get really big. And maybe here also we have a little bit too much space. All right. But by far the biggest and most important change that we did here was this one. But anyway, let's now decrease the secondary and tertiary headings. The primary, I think, is not necessary yet because we just did that here. And so at this point, actually, the primary heading has the same size as the secondary heading. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so in this media query, let's now move both of them here one step down. So from 44 to 36, this one, 3.6 rem. So, and I'm still doing the calculation here as if one rem was still 10 pixels, okay? So just for consistency with the initial code, I will always still assume that one rem is 10 pixels here. All right, so we do not change that mental convention that we have. Okay. The tertiary and font size 2.4 rem. So that is here the next step after 3 rem. Next up, as I was saying, let's also change the grid a little bit. So let's change the column gap. Let's go one step down. So 4.8 is after 6.4. And then the row gap. And this one was very big to begin with. And so let's take this one down even 2 steps. So to 6.4 rem. All right. So let's check it out. So that still looks quite the same. But yeah, if you see here now, this H2 now changes a lot, actually. And also the spacing here now looks a bit better. And especially if we make this even smaller. So of course, we cannot just test at 1200, right? We also need to test, for example, here, maybe at 1000 pixels. So 1050 right now, because of course, we will not add a lot of media queries. Maybe the next one is going to be like at 900 or 950, but so in that range, it needs to look great, right? So here, it's actually still not so great, but I will leave it like this for now, actually. So this section here is a bit hard to fix, and I will maybe fix that a bit later once we go into the next media query. All right. But yeah, so I think everything looks a lot better now, even at this width. So we just did the 1200 media query, but even here, it now looks quite decent. Right. So this is good already. Let's just go up a little bit, because here now the spacing on this side is different than it is here. So you see that this one here is now more on the inside, and the same here on this button. And so that does not look good at all. So we now want this logo here and this button to be aligned to the side. So having basically this same padding that we have here. So let's see where that is. So that's in the navigation, or actually in the header. Yeah, right here. So we have a padding of 4.8 rem on the sides, while on the usual container, we have 3.2. And so that's what we also want in the header. So let's actually copy this line of code here and put that in the header. Okay, great. So now that is consistent. And I was just thinking that here we actually also have this big gap that we had in the grid. So that's the exact same gap. So let's also decrease that. So here in the hero, you see, well, it's actually here. So that the gap is 9.6. So let's also take that down to just 4.8. So here, the hero 4.8 rem. All right. Yeah, so that looks better because now there's more space for this image here to grow a little bit. So that looks nicer. All right. Then of course it starts breaking here again at some point, but that we will fix later. There's just something that I also noticed while preparing this lecture here, which is that on a big size, we actually have way too less space between these menu items. So that's something that we should have done better in the last section. So let's fix that now, actually. So that's here in the menu as well. So yeah, not in the header, but indeed here in the main nav list. So here we want 4.8 at the normal state. So one step up from 3.2. And so that does indeed look a lot better. But now as we come to this smaller width, it is time to then decrease that. All right. So basically we want it to be 3.2 rem. So one step down at this point here. So gap 3.2 rem. Okay. So let's, yeah. So see how the spacing decreases there. So that looks better now on this, let's say, smaller screen. So at this point, we might be ready to actually test this on like a virtual tablet here, like this iPad. And it should be in the landscape view. So that has 1024 pixels. And so that should look good in the media query that we just did. And indeed, I think that it does. So this looks probably a bit similar to what we have when we scale it up. So in the view for the big screen that we developed over the last section. Now here again, it's not perfect, and we might fix that a bit later. All right. So yeah, I don't find any flaws here. We could maybe decrease all the spacing also in the beginning and the end of the sections, so that padding, but yeah, let's not do that. That's starting to become too much work. And yeah, we can also do that maybe in some next media query. Now, maybe just to make this really a lot better, let's maybe actually fix this one here simply by removing some of the padding here on the sides. So this entire element here is called the testimonials container. So I know that was way back. So while you're following these videos here on making the page responsive, you might need to stop the video from time to time in order to go back and analyze the code that we are changing. All right. So I cannot always go back to the HTML and find exactly what is the element that we need to change. So I already know that beforehand. And so I can just tell you here so that we do not waste too much time. Okay. So this testimonials container here is again what has that huge padding. So let's fix that here. And it can stay for now 9.6 rem at the top and bottom, just to stay consistent. But then at the sides, I also wanted to have the same 3.2, just like the header and the container. Okay. And so that now looks quite better again, because now the text looks a bit more like a square here, right? And also now the alignment is exactly as the rest of the page. Okay, now here, of course, there is this too big spacing, but that's not a problem. All right, so I think we are done here for this media query, but of course, we will need a next one soon. So maybe here, for example, we start getting some more problems, and yeah, so let's do that in the next lecture.